In this episode, Neil and I talk about the Commandos and how Lord Lovat and 1st Special Service Brigade came to have their headquarters at Cowdray House. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Neil, we're going to call this podcast Commandos at Cowdray. We're on the edge of the Cowdray House estate and we're on the edge of the Cowdray golf course. We just parked up at Cowdray Cafe. We've walked along the footpath past the holiday huts. Well, on a clear day, we can see the South Downs. We're on quite a nice elevated bit of ground here. Cowdray House, I suppose, is due south of here. We're right by the main gates of Cowdray.
And we're in a small bit of woodland just to the north of the A272, which is sandwiched between the road and the golf course. The reason we're here is because we think this was the site of an assault course in 1944.
Yeah, a commando assault course, exactly. This has been a really good to research because we knew that there were soldiers at Cowdray. When we did a deep dive, we find that not only was it the commandos that are at Cowdray, but one of the World War II heroes, Lord Lovat, and an iconic World War II image, photograph of Lord Lovat on the landing craft, and also the subject of an iconic World War II film, The Longest Day, which is, we'll come on to, that film about D-Day.
6th of June.
Exactly. So in this podcast, we'll go through a history of setting up of the commandos, a few of the famous commando raids. We interviewed a local guy, Den Merritt, who lived on the Cowdray estate during this time, so he had fantastic memories of the commandos there.
And he was just 7 years old in 1939, as far as we're aware.
Yeah, so we interviewed Den for this podcast. We'll try and cover a few of the key characters, Lord Mountbatten, Roger Keyes, all the way up to D-Day.
And we'll obviously relate this to Cowdray itself by bringing in some of Den Merritt's memories. The 15th Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, had an interest right at the start of the war in setting up some sort of special forces, the Commandos. And he'd been working together with these ideas with David Stirling, who set up the SAS. He was well connected across society with this idea of setting up the Commandos, had the blessing of Winston Churchill.
Churchill's involvement goes the whole way through, runs the whole way through this story. Churchill is First Lord of the Admiralty at the outbreak of the war when the Altmark incident takes place. The Altmark is the name of a ship which has captured British merchant men on board, merchant sailors who should have been released as prisoners. They shouldn't have been taken back to Germany. They were captured in the South Atlantic. And British sailors from a Royal Navy destroyer board the Altmark, release the sailors. There's the famous phrase that Churchill uses in his story, "The Navy's here." And for me, that's almost the beginning of the commando ethos, or certainly the beginning in Churchill's mind of, hang on, we can be raiding coasts, we can be using destroyers to be raiding occupied Europe. When Churchill becomes Prime Minister in the middle of the Battle of France, then Dunkirk, immediately after that, on the 6th of June, Churchill sends out a directive that he wants to set up the commandos. Churchill sets up combined operations. The idea of combined operations, Churchill identifies that in June 1940, Britain is on a defensive footing, whether that's the Army, Navy, Air Force, it's on a defensive footing. And Churchill, looking ahead to how does this war going to play out, identifies the need for an aggressive, an offensive department. And that is combined operations. There's a recognition that wars in the future are going to involve Army, Navy, RAF working together, and at the core of the combined operations is setting up of the commandos. The original boss of combined operations and the commandos is Sir Roger Keyes, and we'll come on. That'll be Mountbatten later on.
After the Altmark and the fact that the commandos have been set up, in 1940, 4 commando units were set up. That was 3, 4, 5 and 6. A commando is basically a battalion strength, about 500 strong, and they're volunteers from across the army. They call for volunteers, and by 1940 they've got these 4 commandos.
4 commandos, 500 each.
And the first operation of significance is Operation Claymore, which is the raid on the Lofoten Islands.
Right. Again, there's the connection to the Altmark incident. It's on the Norway coast, albeit a few hundred miles away, but it's on the Norway coast, and that is to capture an island, destroy some industrial plant. They capture some German soldiers. Some Norwegians join them to come back to the UK. So it's a successful raid.
Operation in March 41. There were other smaller raids between them, but the next big raid which is worth discussing, is possibly the Dieppe raid in August 1942.
Do you know, Neil, I've skipped over something there. It might be worth taking a second to discuss the ethos and background of the Commandos. I think we both have a loose sense of what the Commandos are. You mentioned this is a unit, is that the right word, of 2,000 men, 4 Commandos, 2,000 men. These are the original special forces. These are elite units. You apply to become a commando. This would have been appealing if you were an action-orientated guy and you were UK based at the time.
Because a lot of the soldiers at that point, certainly after Dunkirk, were sitting around and thinking, I want to get on with this war. I want to do something. I don't want to be sitting around in a barracks in the UK. I want to fight the Germans. So when this message came through, do you want to volunteer? Lots of volunteers came forward.
There's a super high standard. This is speed marching and assault courses, live fire. Yeah, this is all special forces style training, what we would think of now, and we'll come on to this later in the podcast. This is what we would think of now as Royal Marines, SAS. It's that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Dieppe raid,
August 1942. This is a lot larger than Operation Claymore. The main bulk of the attacking force is Canadians towards the beach at Dieppe. There is a recognition that it wasn't planned in enough detail because this was not a success. As it so happens, Lord Lovat was commanding 4 Commando. He was a lieutenant colonel at this stage, and he was on the east flank, and he basically took out the 6 German guns that could have threatened the invasion fleet on the east flank, on the cliffs to the east of Dieppe. So that was 4 Commando. 3 Commando were on the west flank. They got heavy casualties. They were shot up in their landing craft. The Dieppe raid itself, which was mainly Canadians, probably about over 6,000 troops involved. Only 2,400 came back to the UK. They weren't all killed. A lot of them were prisoners of war. So this was by no means a success. And in Lord Lovat's book, March Past, he's actually quite scathing about the pre-planning that went into this. I'm not sure whether combined operations were heavy. I'm sure they were involved. With the passage of time, this now looks like a very useful practice on how not to do it when you come to opening the second front, on what we now know as D-Day. As is well known, D-Day was successful, probably because of the lives lost on the Dieppe raid in 42.
Right, yes, there are all sorts of lessons learnt there. The number one is not to attack a major population centre in daylight. The thing that goes well is the use of Commando special forces to capture the guns that are overlooking the beaches.
And put them out of action.
And that's something that the British and the Americans will do on D-Day. This might be a point just if we're trying to go chronologically. After the Lofoten raids, the Commandos are taken over by Mountbatten in time for the Dieppe raids. Mountbatten, he's a Navy captain. He connected to Churchill, we'll come on to that, but he's chosen by Churchill to take over combined operations. He's given a senior RAF rank so that he has authority, I suppose, Neil. You can tell me how this works. He has authority over all of these branches. So he takes over after the Lofoten raid in early 42. He makes the decision. He's come from the Navy background to bring in the Royal Marines. We've had the success of the Commandos, and we can talk about details like, these are well-known stories like the Cockle Shell Heroes. Obviously, the Lofoten raid, there have been these successful commando operations. They know they're onto something here. This is something that works. We need to expand it. We're going to need to expand it to prepare for D-Day. Where do we get these men from? Where do we get these specialised skills from? So recruitment for the Commandos goes into overdrive in the regular army. An interesting point, this is really not popular with the regular army commanders because they're losing their best guys. But the ready-made source of trained men is the Royal Marines. Up until this point, Royal Marines have been used to man the secondary armaments on ships, the anti-aircraft, the smaller guns. That's been the role of the Royal Marines. So there's this ready-made source of Royal Navy. Mountbatten's a Navy guy. These ready-made source of men that they can bring in from the Royal Navy into the Commandos. They have to go through the same commando training as the Army Commandos. Nice anecdote. A good friend of ours from the running club, Howard Bidmead, his father, Bill Bidmead, is on the boat in the famous photograph with the famous photograph of the landing craft on D-Day next to or just behind
Lord Lovat, and Piper Millen.
It's amazing. It's one of the most famous, iconic photographs. You see it and you've seen it before. That iconic D-Day photograph, Howard's dad's in that. Now, Howard's dad was a Army commando, and he said that Howard remembered him saying that the Royal Marines commandos were not quite up to the same standard.
Yeah. Bill Bidmead was in 4 Commando. 4 Commando was Lovat's commando. They were even better than 3 Commando, because 3 Commando got a bit of a pasting at Dieppe, and so they had to have a lot more replacements in, because they lost quite a few men. I can't remember how many. So 4 Commando was the best commando, specifically as it was led by Lord Lovat, who had a sterling reputation, if I'm not mixing
commandos.
Too many commando metaphors.
We have the massive expansion of the Commandos in 1942 because of the inclusion of the Royal Marines. Now, here's the key. Let's bring it back to Midhurst.
Yeah.
We were super excited that the Commandos were at Cowdray. Then we found out that actually they're commanded by legendary leader Lord Lovat, and what connected them? That was so interesting. So
you've done the research on the family history, so why don't you go into that, Tim?
This is going to be a first for podcasting, Neil, because we're going to do a family tree over a podcast. So this could go one of 2 ways. Neil's giving me a helpful thumbs up, good luck. Let's start with the easy bit. We were wondering, why is Lord Lovat here at Cowdray? What particularly during Cowdray? It's a great area for training, and it's close to the south coast for raids or for the build up to D-Day. But what we felt like there was something more to it than that. It turns out that Lord Lovat and Lord Cowdray, John Cowdray, were at Oxford at the same time, so they would have known each other. When we looked into it a bit more deeply, we're going to do 2 generations here. When we looked into it a bit more deeply, their fathers, now locals will not be surprised to hear that there's a polo connection here. Lord Lovat's father was super keen on polo. That is how he would have known Harold Cowdray or Harold Pearson through polo. We can guess, we didn't have any evidence for this, we didn't find any evidence in the books, that the sons would have known each other. They were the same age, they were at Oxford at the same time, so that would be John Cowdray and Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser. We would guess that those 2 would have known each other. Their dads are polo mates. They would have stayed with each other's estates, you might think. We think they know each other. There's an interesting connection to the other heroes of our story, because Harold Churchill, John Churchill's father, was married to Agnes Spencer Churchill, who was Churchill's first cousin. We have a direct connection here to the Churchills and the Mountbattens, because we were thinking, well, why is Louis Mountbatten, this is for anyone who's watched The Crown, this is perfect, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's the connection to the Mountbattens? Well, in the opening days of World War I, Churchill is again First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the outbreak of both wars. He's First Lord of the Admiralty, World War I, and the First Sea Lord, his naval counterpart, is Mountbatten's father. He has to resign because of his Austrian ancestry. That's the connection between Churchill and the Mountbattens. They know each other from World War I. Churchill's related through his cousin to the Cowdrays, and the Cowdray and Lord Lovat Jr. would have known each other from their time at Oxford. Here's the key. It's a military connection, because Cowdray Senior, John Cowdray, John Pearson, Lord Cowdray, was a major in the army, in the British Expeditionary Force in North France. He lost his arm at Dunkirk, so he's out of the regular army, but he is a lieutenant colonel
in Dad's army,
in the Home Guard.
In the Home Guard.
So he's obviously going to be interested in military matters. The Commandos are the exciting thing at the time. It's the Commandos that are doing these raids that's the new exciting thing. I think that with the personal connection, with his interest in military matters, he would have either invited Lovat here, or Lord Lovat would have made the connection himself.
And to bring it sort of back to Sussex in a way, we're talking about early 1944. There was, in the build-up to D-Day, there were so many troops in the area they were all using as headquarters. They were all using stately homes in the area as well. So this specific area, as well as Cowdray House, and that was the headquarters for the 1st Special Service Brigade. Mm-hmm. So what happened in early 1944 is Lord Lovat, who had been a lieutenant colonel, we get the impression he liked being with his soldiers. He was promoted to brigadier, and there's a nice touch in his book where he complains to some of his staff officers, his new staff officers, do I have to wear the red tabs of a brigadier? And the staff officers say, sir, you've always criticised the red flannel of staff officers and the inefficiency. Now you are one. You can't go slagging them off, so you've got to start wearing the red tabs. But anyway, he's promoted brigadier, and as well as 4 commando, he will be commanding 3 commando, 6 commando, and 4-5 commando. That's about 2,000 commandos. So that's what he's commanding in the 1st Special Service Brigade.
And that a brigade is 2,000 men, is it?
A formal brigade in the regular army is probably more than that. Might be 3,000,
yes.
3,500. Depends on the units that are involved. But yeah, so he's got 4 commandos or battalions. The regular army would call them.
Right.
But in the commando terminology, they are commandos on their battalion size. Also, in the vicinity, there's another Special Service Brigade, which is mainly made up of Royal Marine Commandos, and that's the 4th Special Service Brigade.
Right.
We think they're somewhere in Sussex. We think their headquarters are possibly at what is now Seaford College, was called Lavington House, or Burton Park. But also at Lavington House, there is the command element for the brigade. So above the 2 brigades, there is the command group, and it's called the Special Service Group. And that is the 2 commando brigades. That is also based locally. We also know from Dan Merritt and other people, there was lots of soldiers in early 44, certainly in the build-up to D-Day, camped out in Petworth Park, certainly in May, because King George VI inspected the troops on the 22nd of May in Petworth Park, and there was between 4,000 and 4,500 troops in Petworth Park. Bivouacked, we suspect. A lot of the brigade were based over there.
Right.
It's likely that 4 commando were based over there, and together with 27th Armoured Brigade. I haven't got an exact date, but I think in May, Montgomery, who was the overall commander of 21st Army Group, which all these elements were supporting, he and Eisenhower came down to Petworth Park to inspect the troops, and they stayed overnight in the Old Swan in Petworth. There was troops based north of Lodsworth, there was troops based in Blackdown, Curdford, and there was in Goodwood House near Chichester, there was Royal Army Medical Corps. It was a general hospital set up, obviously for the expected casualties from D-Day. So we've got one more figure, which is like the number of Canadians in Sussex was in 1944 was 70,000. Interestingly, that's a lot of soldiers, but to give a bit of context to that, that's the size of the British Army today, 70,000.
Wow, 70,000 Canadians. So many lines we can go down here, but I mean, the point about the Canadians is such an interesting one. 70,000 Canadians here in Sussex. Of course, at this time there are Canadians in Italy as well.
Yeah.
We should have an episode on the Canadians.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned there Den Merritt. Well, we introduced him at the beginning. Local guy, grew up here. Now, the interesting thing is that his family lives, or he and his mother live on the estate. His father was working in Wales. He was living in I can't remember the name of the building, but it's like a stable block. It's like a stable block with accommodation.
Yeah.
He lives there. He was describing commandos going out on exercise with camo paint on, telling us what Cowdray was like there. A century with Alsatian dogs. He told us that his mother was arrested, apprehended, tried to come onto the estate without the right papers. This is high security, isn't it?
She was probably detained. She probably wasn't arrested. She was probably detained before her identity was confirmed.
Yes.
So it does indicate the level of security for the commandos, and they were relatively sensitive, the commandos, spies, because obviously it was a relatively sensitive organisation. So it makes sense. And also he very interestingly told us about captured equipment that brought back.
This was totally new information. We haven't found evidence if this recorded anywhere else, and there probably wouldn't be, because this was borderline top secret information. But Den remembered the commandos telling him that these were captured German motorbikes. He remembered them being tan-coloured, desert camouflage, and he remembered them tearing up and down the main drive at Cowdray. And we looked for bits of evidence for this. Now, number one, the timings are right. There's an awful lot of captured equipment in 1943 from North Africa, where the Germans have evacuated Tunis. So there's an awful lot of captured equipment. This equipment may have been captured in an official capacity and given to the commandos to train with, because that fits with the commando ethos, operating behind enemy lines, captured equipment, moving fast. So it would make sense for them to be training on this equipment.
And there is an element in Lord Lovat's book where he talks about exercises, and you can imagine they want to make the exercises in the UK as realistic as possible. And there's an exercise, I think it was Worthing, where he had the enemy force dressed in German uniforms, and after the exercise was finished, they went into a pub and scared all the local residents because they thought obviously Germany had invaded. The use of equipment, German weapons and uniforms, helmets, and possibly motorbikes, just added an element of realism to all the rehearsals and exercises that were going on pre-D-Day.
Yeah. There's a different theory to this, Neil. I was thinking that the motorbikes could have been there in an official capacity, and actually his wife Marie confirmed that. She said after the war she remembered that the yards there had been used for, well, we know they were used as a motor vehicle maintenance.
Motor coach company, Royal Army Service Corps.
Right.
So providing transport for the army.
She said all those yards were still covered in a layer of oil in the 50s. It's quite possible that those motorbikes were there in an official way for training, but it's also possible that young men packing up, if they'd captured a motorbike in North Africa, I think it's coming.
Just be able to bring it home.
Yeah, I think it's coming. I think it's coming back with you, exactly. His other memory is that this area was the assault course, and this is absolutely key to commando training. It's the assault course. They use live fire to make it realistic. Lovett actually says in his book that he builds a deluxe pillbox with perspex glass just to get guys used to the
live ammunition being fired. Right. That sounds scary. And where we are, the Cowdray maintenance yard is in a small quarry, so that does lend itself to a zip wire. So we think and according to Den, we're in the right place as to where this assault course and zip wire was.
These soldiers are being brought up to their high state of readiness. They're being trained. The next step before D-Day will be to be transferred from here down to Southampton, where they'll go into a holding camp.
Interesting, as far as we're aware, even in early June, whilst Lord Lovett was here, he had no idea where they would be going to, because obviously he knew what the plan was, but not the location. So he says in his book, he has people strung out along the Sussex coast as far east as Eastbourne. I think he says from Eastbourne to Worthing, he has the other commandos. I think that's 45 Commando and the other commandos. So they're in Sussex, possibly ready to go via Newhaven, Pas de Calais or something like that. And it's only when he receives the orders, and there's a nice touch in his biography where he talks about he's here at Cowdray. We don't know the exact date, but it's probably around 2nd, 3rd of June, maybe. He says, I got my message through dispatch riders and had to move to Southampton. He still wouldn't have been given the plan. And I wanted a last breakfast with John Cowdray. So then he moves, and his commandos all move towards holding areas or assembly areas near to Southampton. Some of them went via Marchwood, and that would have been on the 4th, 5th of June. Once they were in these assembly areas, they were held in those areas because they were then given the plan. They didn't want the plan being talked about in local pubs, so the guys, once all the soldiers got the plan, they weren't allowed out of camp.
Right.
Basically, it's from there to Normandy.
It obviously didn't go too badly, did it? Because Cowdray's invited Lovett for breakfast on the morning. They've turned his house into a fortress. He's got these commandos running around, racing motorbikes up and down his driveway. He obviously hasn't been too bad a house guest if
he's been invited for breakfast.
If he's been, exactly. So it might have just been good riddance, but sounds okay.
So D-Day itself, the first Lovett's organisation, the 1st Special Service Brigade, is on the far east flank of the whole of the D-Day beaches.
Coming to D-Day now, the commandos are going to take, exactly as you say, Neil, the far east flank. It's Sword Beach is the British beach, one of the British beaches, and they are taking Queen, which is the sector on the far east of that beach. Yeah. I've got the map in my mind here, Neil, so I'm just going to describe it. They're landing an hour after the first wave. So the soldiers have come onto the beach. Town is Oostrum. They are on the edge of the town of Oostrum, and the idea is that they will be able to cut through the beach. Don't want to get bogged down in anything, because their objective is to relieve the paratroopers who've landed about 4 miles inland on Pegasus Bridge. The objective of the Commandos is to relieve the paratroopers who've landed by glider. They're holding that bridge. It's important to hold the bridge to stop the German tanks getting to the beach.
Exactly. And it's the bridge over the River Orne.
So the idea is that the Commandos will be able to, Lovett's Commandos will be able to steam straight through cross country. It's about, looking at the map, it looks like about 6k of open countryside to be able to relieve the paratroopers. But it's not as straightforward as that. The D-Day landings haven't gone as successfully as they were supposed to. There's still an awful lot of fighting to be done.
Exactly. So all his Special Service Brigade are landing in Oostrum. The force is stuck on the beach, the regular army. I can't remember which division it was. Mm-hmm. There's still tanks on the beach. The commandos actually have to fight their way through Oostrum. One of the commandos, within the commando elements, there's the French commandos are within one of the commandos. It's probably a squadron within there. They do a lot of the fighting in Oostrum, and they get a bit of a pasting as well. Whereas other commandos, remember he's got 4 commandos, push on out to the east and cross the Cairn Canal and the Orne River to get towards the bridge at Ranville. So it's not as straightforward as the plan, because they always say that no plan survives contact with the enemy. As
happens in the film, we do more research than just watching the film for these, promise. But in the film, Lord Lovat turns up with his bagpiper playing. I think that happens. Yep. He's playing the bagpipes on the beach. Lord Lovat says that he doesn't have to comply with normal military rule because he's Scottish.
Maybe.
Normal rules don't apply to him. That's what he says. He has a bagpiper, and he's got Howard's dad. They march up to the beach and relieve them. In the film, I think they say, sorry, we're 2 minutes late. Actually, I think they're about an hour or two late. They turn up in the middle of the afternoon. They've arrived. They've landed on the beach at about 8 o'clock. And I think they turn up middle of the afternoon.
They hold the bridge. So all good news in the end. From his brigade, casualties were relatively light. They then had to hold that area for another 3 or 4 days, the area on the east flank. There were a number of attempted German counterattacks on that east flank. There's a fair bit of fighting over the next few days. Going back to Midhurst, just a nice little anecdote we did pick up on is that, and we got that from local sources as well, is that Lord Lovat, bless him, lived in temporary accommodation in Esborne whilst he was working here at Cowdray House. And we know that his wife, Rosamond, or Rosie, I think she was called, and 3 kids were living in Dodsley Grove.
Yeah, I reckon I can see that house from my house.
Yeah, another local made comment of the fact that he used to see a handsome chap walking past on his way to work, which of course it would have been a relatively short walk from Dodsley Grove up to Cowdray House. We're not sure if he was wearing a kilt or not, but I guess Lord Lovat, a bit of a 1944 celebrity, and people probably would have known in Midhurst who he was.
Well, I love the story. I love the Cowdray connection. Not surprising that Polo was at the centre of this.
After a bit of fighting in northern France and Normandy, the Commandos came back to Petworth Park in early September. They'd done a fair bit of fighting in the Cairn operation, and they came back for R&R.
Good. Neil, I've really enjoyed this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Good.